Okay, good morning everybody, shalom and welcome to today's very exciting Tanya class as we conclude the first section of the magnus opus of Chabad philosophy. It's the book of Tanya. We've been studying this book for about 3 years now, maybe more, and it's been a journey in life. Not just a journey through pages, it's a journey through flesh and blood instead of just a journey through ink and paper. As many Hasidim have been wont to say, that the book of Tanya is not a book that you read, it's a book that you breathe. When someone met his friend and he asked him, what book are you reading? He said, the book of Tanya. How long have you been reading it? He said, about 2 years. Right? This first round of Tanya that we're about to conclude is not the end. It is the beginning. Because remember, the meaning of the word Chabad means logic. It stands for 3 words. Chachma, Bina, Da'as. Chachma, Bina, Da'as are the 3 steps of intellectual assimilation that I translate as idea, understanding, and meditation. Chabad is idea, understanding, and meditation. You cannot be a Chabadnik if you only have an idea that you have understood. If you've not meditated upon it, you're not a Chabadnik, you're a Chabad. But you're not a Chabadnik, right? In order to be a Chabadnik, you've got to be able to meditate upon the wisdom after you've understood it. And that's why the real study begins not when you open the book. The real study begins when you close the book. And that's what we're holding today. As we're finishing chapter 53, the 53rd chapter of Tanya now, I'm very grateful to our partner in Jakarta, Indonesia. That is Winston, who's live with us right now. Now, Winston is working hard to sequence all of the Tanya classes, and he already has them sequenced. Winston, if you don't mind posting the link to all the Tanya classes here on YouTube and Facebook. But what Winston is doing is that he's actually taking the video classes have been all recorded since the beginning of the pandemic on video, and they are from chapter 23 and onwards. But the first 23 chapters were recorded via audio before the pandemic. So Winston is converting them from audio files into video files, and he's uploading them hopefully by next week onto YouTube. They'll all be there. We are missing chapters 1, 2, 3, and 11. They never made the audio recording. And therefore, after chapter 53, this is our schedule. We're going to go back to redo chapter 1, 2, 3, and 11. We'll teach those chapters. And that's why, Winston, we will have a complete video and audio recording of the entire first 53 chapters of Tanya, after which we will then be publishing the Tanya in Palm Beach Gardens, as we spoke about this past Friday. We watched the videos of the Rebbe about the Rebbe's call to publish the Tanyas in every location where there are Jewish people living. We will be publishing the Tanya here in Palm Beach Gardens to mark the conclusion of our study of the book of Tanya. Good morning to you, Marty and Dean and Joe, as well as Winston, who just posted the link to the Tanya class recordings on YouTube. Good morning to you, Elaine and Winston. Good morning to you live, David and Ed and Harry and Keith, and everybody else that's with us, both live and later. Those that are with us on a revealed level and those that are with us on a concealed level. We've learned this in Tanya, that there's much more to the eye than what we see. So in addition to all the people that we see that are present with us in person, there are many more that are present with us, not present in person. They are present, we just can't see them. So a major theme in Tanya. Without much further ado, let's go straight into the theme of chapter 53, the final chapter of the first book of Tanya, which is, and after which, by the way, after we publish the Tanya, we're going to proceed into the second part of Tanya, which is Shari Yichud Ve'emunah, the gates of trust. The gates of unity and faith. We've learned the gates of trust, which was the 15th century treatise by Rabbi Bachaye. That's the gates of trust. But we will be proceeding into the second section of Tanya, which is the gates of unity and faith. Gates of Unity and Faith, which is by the Alter Rebbe. It's the second part of Tanya, after which we'll be doing the treatise, the letter of repentance, which is the third part of Tanya, and we'll continue from there. Without any further ado, I'm going to go straight into chapter 53, whose theme is the main thing is action. You see, in chapter 53, we tie all loose ends together. The first 9 chapters of Tanya were focused on our hardware. What lies beneath our hood? What kind of engine we have underneath the hood? Most of us don't even know what our soul is made up of. We wouldn't recognize our soul if it slapped us across the face. We wouldn't even know that is our soul. We wouldn't even know what our soul looks like. So the first 9 chapters of Tanya just introduces us to what our soul is, and we're startled to discover that we have not one but 2 of them. You got a godly soul and an animal soul, right? Then from chapters 10 all the way through to 25, the Alter Rebbe led us through the long way and the short way of soul mastery, of allowing our godly soul to dominate over our animal soul. From chapters 26 through 33, we went through certain soul hacks, shortcut methods to handling the most popular struggles of our soul, of our internal struggles. And then from chapters 33 all the way through to chapter 51, we went through the importance. Well, it's really chapter 33 to chapter 37. We spoke about the importance of action. This is very, very important. We spoke about the importance of action, contrasting to many other religions which feel that spirituality is the abandonment of physical experience. Well, spirituality is the abandonment of physical experience. But other religions believe that holiness is associated more with spirituality than with physicality. Again, I'm going to say that again slowly. Other religions believe that holiness is associated more with the spiritual than it is with the physical. Which is why they don't get married, celibacy, they don't drink wine, they don't eat meat maybe, they fast a lot, right? They have vows of silence, abstinence. Tanya teaches us exactly the opposite is true. Holiness is not the abandonment of the physical. Holiness is the fulfillment of what God wants. What does God want? Well, He put us in this world, so He wants us to be here, right? He put us in this dysfunctional world because He wants us to turn the dysfunction into function. He wants us to turn the darkness of this physical world into light. Therefore, to be holy, says the Tanya, is to engage with the physical. A profound, life-changing concept, which we developed through chapters 33 all the way through to 37, explaining that the purpose of life is in this physical world. This is ground zero of the universe. But then in chapters 38 all the way through to 51, the Alter Rebbe said, but don't forget, as important as it is to be able to focus on the physical, don't forget what you're bringing to the physical. The guest that you're inviting to this physical world is godliness. But what degree of godliness are you drawing? It all depends on what order you put in, right? It all depends on your vibrations. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So depending on your kavanah, your mindfulness, will depend what degree of holiness, what height of holiness, what height of godliness, what intensity or quality of godliness you'll be drawing down to this physical world. Think of it like a radio signal, right? Well, how clear is your radio signal? Well, it depends on, I guess, your hardware. I'm not a radio tech, but I guess it depends on your radio. Probably depends on your location, your antenna, right? That kind of stuff, right? So if you put out the right hardware and the right software, I guess you'll be drawing down the right signal, right? The right clarity. So it's all very nice to have a HD, FD, whatever, 5-dimensional television, right? Which shows the most amazing visuals. But the question is, what are you feeding into your television? Right? Don't forget that so the television is bringing images into your living room. Life is wonderful, right? It's good. But the question is, what are you bringing into your television? So now you got to think about the subscriptions that you're paying, right? Am I subscribing to, Tom and Jerry, Mickey Mouse? Am I subscribing to Albert Einstein's Secrets of the Universe, right? I mean, the question is, what are you drawing into your television, right? So when you are fulfilling your purpose as a Jew upon this earth, which is to draw godliness down to this earth, and that was a major theme of Tanya, the doctrine of Dira v'Tachtonim, the doctrine of making a home for God upon this physical world. When you do that, we understand that physical is not to be abstained. Physical is not to be ignored. Physical is not to be run away from. It's like a horse that you're supposed to tame and ride, as opposed to shun, right? So you're supposed to turn this physical earth into a place that is able to bear godliness and holiness, to be permeated with godliness instead of a place which is opposed to it, right? But when you're bringing godliness down to this earth, the degree of godliness that you bring down to this earth depends on your kavanah and your mindfulness. And that was the meditations that we discussed in chapters 38 all the way through to chapter 51, which was the various loves, the different kinds of love and different kinds of awe that you were able to tap into depending upon your spiritual maturity, right? And that's a lifetime of work to be able to reach these different degrees of godly awareness, which ultimately lead to godly awe and godly love, right? The question is, are you even conscious? Are you even awake? Do you even have an emotional relationship with God, right? Because you know what your marriage would look like if you had no emotional connection to your spouse. It would be sad, right? Right? And the spouse wouldn't be excused for saying, well, I mean, there is no excuse not to have an emotional relationship with your spouse. I can't even think of a half-decent excuse. In exactly the same way, you cannot get away. You cannot leave this world by saying that I never had the opportunity to develop an emotional relationship with God Almighty, with my Father in heaven. If you've never developed a relationship with your God, with your Father in heaven, it's like you slept your way through existence. And what an epic tragedy that is, that God gave you the gift of life and you wasted it watching TV. I mean, what were you doing? Like what were you busy with, right? I'd like to welcome David Rosen from Lakewood, New Jersey, Rob Berger from Chicago, Adrian from Ibis, and Joni, who just celebrated a birthday. All with us here on Facebook and YouTube. Good to see everybody. Okay, so now chapter 51 and 52 were leading up to the crux, which is chapter 53 today, which is tying it all together. Now that we've understood, right? It's like the ribbon. You know, the ribbon goes this way and then back, right? Now that we've understood the importance of action, yet we also need to be able to have kavanah, to have mindfulness and meditation in our divine service in this physical world, which means when you do tefillin, which is a physical mitzvah, you do it with the right meditation. You don't just do it mindlessly, you do it mindfully. When you make a blessing on food, which is a mitzvah, you do it mindfully, not mindlessly. You have actual love for God when you acknowledge God in the blessing on this delicious, incredible food that God has made for you, right? And you imagine saying that blessing on the food, Amotzi lechem min haaretz, with a feeling of love, like you would feel when you give your wife a precious gift, right? Can you imagine that you had that degree of spiritual and emotional maturity? It's not that difficult. Right? That's what we're trying to reach. Yet, after all is said and done, comes the Alter Rebbe in chapter 53, and he ties it all together by reminding us of the metaphor that we were introduced to in chapter 35. The metaphor goes like this, and I want you to see the metaphor for yourself, just to remind you of it. It's on page 675. 675 in the Practical Tanya. This is the edition of Tanya that we use, printed by Kol Menachem Publications. The Practical Tanya, it's available on Amazon. It goes like this. The Zohar, this is quoted in chapter 35 of Tanya. It was opened in chapter 35 of Tanya, and it's concluded now in chapter 53 of Tanya, just to remind you of the actual metaphor which comes from the Zohar. The Zohar, which is the foundational text of Kabbalah, says like this: a person should not walk 4 cubits with his head uncovered. 4 cubits is about 8 feet. What's the reason? Because the divine presence rests on his head, and the eyes and words of every wise man are on his head. What does that mean? Meaning to say, his attention is focused on what rests and remains on his head. So the eyes of a wise man are focused on his head, are focused on what rests on his head. What is that? That's the divine presence, the Shekhinah. And when his eyes are there, he will be aware that the flame lit above his head, which is the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is in need of oil. In order to maintain the divine presence upon your head, you need to be able to have oil, since a person's body is a wick with a flame lit above it. And King Solomon shouts out to us, don't allow oil to be lacking from your head. V'shemen al reishcha al techsar. That's a verse in Ecclesiastes and Kohelet, because the flame on his head needs oil, referring to good deeds. So it's a little bit cryptic, a little enigmatic, this metaphor here. It talks about a person not walking bareheaded. Why? Because there's a flame on top of your head, and a wise man is aware of what's on top of his head. What's that flame on top of your head? It's a divine presence, but the divine presence cannot rest on your head unless it's got oil, because the divine presence is exactly like a candle. What is a candle? It's made up of three parts. There's the wick, there's the flame, and then there's the wax, or the oil, right? Wick, flame, oil. So we understand that in a physical sense, that's easy. But on a spiritual metaphor, it's like this. The flame, the fire is God Almighty, right? Is God Almighty. Hashem, the divine presence that rests upon you. It's the ethereal light. It's the light that wants to run away like a candle. We learned in chapter 19 that the origin of fire is actually beneath the orbit of the moon. We've learned about this idea earlier in Tanya. The origin of fire is beneath the orbit of the moon, and it's invisible, by the way. Fire wants to go back to its origin. That's why it's pulling upwards. The only reason why it stays down here is because it's tethered by the wick. Why is it not leaving the wick? Because the oil burns it slowly. The oil makes it burn slowly. But once it finishes burning, once it finishes its job, what's it going to do? It's going to dissipate and disappear back to its origin, which is beneath the orbit of the moon. Now, if you want to maintain the flame, you got to make sure there's a healthy supply of oil. That's what King Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. Oil should never be lacking upon your head. What that means is that you need to be having good deeds, because in the metaphor, the divine presence will only dwell upon your wick. What's your wick? Your body, right? Your body is your wick. Your body and your animal soul, by the way, is your wick. And what's going to continue? The divine presence resting upon your body and your animal soul, a shidduch as unlikely as fire and wick. Fires and strings don't like to stick together. You know, they rip through each other and they're done, right? What makes them work together nice and slow, nice and smooth, is only if there is a shadchan, a matchmaker, a broker, and that would be oil, wick, wax, or in this case, in the spiritual metaphor, in the analog, would be good deeds, mitzvahs. When you have good deeds, mitzvahs, so for example, like a yarmulke on your head, right? When you do the good deeds, you're maintaining the flame upon your head. And that's what we're going to be tying together right now in chapter 53. Because in chapter 51 and 52, we explained that the light of the divine presence, the flame, dwells upon the spiritual worlds. It's a very, very powerful, blinding light in each world. We explained in chapter 51 and 52 that it's got to have a garment, like a shield. So in the higher spiritual world, that shield is the levels of Chabad, the wisdom of each world. Without getting too technical right now, it's a little abstract, but each world has wisdom and emotions, right? Intellect and emotions. The intellect is the highest level of the world. The Chabad of each world is the sheath that shields, that serves as a garment to the divine light, to the spiritual, to the divine presence in each world. And that's in the higher world. But what about this physical world? Where does the divine presence rest in this physical world? The Alter Rebbe tells us. He said it dwells in the Ark of the Covenant, in the Holy of Holies, in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Because what was inside of the Ark of the Covenant? God's gift to mankind, the 2 tablets of sapphire given to Moses on Mount Sinai, literally out of heaven, right? Those 10 commandments, the 2 tablets of sapphire, were a miraculous piece of physicality given by God, made by God. Literally. And they were the embodiment of the divine presence in this world. We could actually see that in a physical sense, because when you looked at the 10 commandments, at the 2 tablets of sapphire, they were a defiance of physical reality. I'll tell you why, because they were engraved through and through. Now, what happens if you engrave writing on through and through of a piece of rock, of sapphire? You'll be able to read it on the one side. What's the other side going to look like? Backward, reversed. But the Torah tells us that you can read it on both sides. And that doesn't make any sense. It's like impossible. How's that even possible to read something engraved on both sides? It doesn't make sense, right? Also, the Talmud tells us that when something's engraved through and through, what's going to happen to the letters that are completely round, like a samach, which is a circle? What's going to happen to the piece in the middle? It's going to fall. So the Talmud tells us that the middle of the samach and the middle of the final mem, both of whom are complete letters, were miraculously suspended in the middle. So there was a manifestation of divinity, of infinity going on inside of the 10 commandments, and that is where the divine presence was resting inside of this world. Now, all that is wonderful until the destruction of the first temple, when the 10 commandments, The 2 tablets were hidden away, never to return to the second temple. The second temple, the Holy of Holies was empty. It just had the rock of foundation. That's what the Arabs claim is the dome of the rock. What they're calling the dome of the rock is the rock of foundation, the foundation stone of the universe, which was the focal point of our holy temple. Right? So Islam, which is only 1,500 years old, right, is built on the site of the Jewish temple, which was destroyed 2,000 years ago. Our temple was destroyed 500 years before the first Muslim ever walked the face of this earth, right? Yet somehow we have to fight about our right to exist in the United Nations. Talk about rewriting history, right? So the second temple did not have the Ark of the Covenant. It's the revelation of godliness, therefore, there was much less. But since the second temple was destroyed, where does the divine presence dwell? And this is this magnificent chiddush, the novelty of the Alter Rebbe in chapter 53. The divine presence dwells in the Torah, in the study of Torah. Hence, when the Talmud says in Brachos chapter 1 in the Talmud, it says that whoever, even an individual who studies Torah, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is with him. That's what it's talking about. If you sit and study Torah, even if you're on your own, the divine presence dwells upon you, just like it would upon the Holy of Holies in the first temple, in the 10 Commandments. More specifically, the Alter Rebbe proceeds to say, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is drawn not only through Torah, but through practical mitzvahs, since the practical mitzvahs are the fulfillment and the ultimate goal of Torah. Torah is telling us to ultimately do the will of God. So when we actually fulfill the will of God is where the divine presence dwells. And therefore, the Alter Rebbe takes it even one step further, and he says that even in Torah study itself, it's within the refinement, it's in the clarification of the law of halacha. Within halacha, the law, that is exactly the spot, the presence of where the divine presence sits. It's within Torah, within the practical component of Torah, within the actual law, the bottom line halacha. That's where the will of God is crystallized, right? And you'll notice in the Talmud, this opinion says that, and that opinion says this, and the ultimate consensus would be ruled this way, right? So that final ruling, how to cook something, permissible ways, methods of cooking on Shabbos, let's say, right? Permissible methods of cooking on Yom Tov, right? Permissible ways of running a kosher kitchen, right? Those actual applicable, actual practical laws are the manifestation of the will of God, and that is exactly the point where the divine presence dwells. And that's why, my friends, it's so important to us to always make sure that we're learning halacha, we're learning Jewish law. As much as it's exciting and inspiring to learn the ethereal and abstract components of Judaism, the meditational components of Judaism, you can never lose sight of the fact that it's important to have halacha, which is Jewish law. It might be more boring, right, to learn the do's and the don'ts. But within the do's and the don'ts lie the essence of what it means to be a Jew. We don't study Torah only because it's inspiring. We study Torah because we're fulfilling the will of God and we're in service of God, and the commander-in-chief wants us to fulfill a mission, right? So a soldier in the army doesn't just listen to the general when the general is giving interesting speeches. The soldier in the army listens to the general when he tells them to go out at 5 o'clock in the morning when it's freezing cold and to jump into an ice cold river. You do whatever he tells you to do, right? So when the commander-in-chief tells us to do something, that's when we go out to do it. That's why it's so important for us to do the actual halacha, the day-to-day laws. Now, to answer your question, Winston on YouTube, the fire is under the head cover. You're confusing the analog with the metaphor. So in the analog, the fire, there's a fire, right? That fire is the divine presence, right? So the head cover, you're mixing the fire and the head cover. It's like the guy's head's on fire or something. His head's not on fire. We're talking about the fire is a metaphor for the divine presence, which rests upon you through the good deeds. So the yarmulke, for example, is a mitzvah. It's a good deed that retains the fire of the divine presence upon you, but it's not that your head's on fire or your yarmulke is on fire. Don't worry about it. All right, good. Fine. Next, keep on going up here. This is the meaning now, as he ties it all together. This is the meaning of what this metaphor in the Zohar is, that the flame needs oil in order to burn. The oil that retains the divine presence upon us specifically is Torah and mitzvahs, right? That's what he says in this metaphor. Don't allow oil to be lacking from your head because the flame on his head needs oil, referring to good deeds. Mitzvahs. If you want to introduce godliness into your life, if you want to be able to break the glass ceiling and to live a life that's not just finite but infinite, a life not only of a creation but to be able to incorporate and invite the Creator into your life, to be able to experience God's speed in your life, the way that you can bring infinity, Almighty Creator God into you is through Torah and mitzvahs. By making sure every day to study Torah and to actually do mitzvahs. See, studying Torah is not just something that Jews do to keep themselves busy. It's not just something that we do in order to get a profession, to become a rabbi, or to gain wisdom. We study Torah for the journey in and of itself. We study Torah to be able to experience the presence of God within us. That's it. Even if you're 98 years old and you don't think you're ever going to be able to apply this wisdom. And that's why you'll notice that Mordechai, during the Purim story, when Haman was in the middle of executing this horrible decree of annihilation against the entire Jewish people, the worst decree of Holocaust that our people have ever faced. What was Mordechai busy doing? He was teaching Torah to 22,000 Jewish children. What was he teaching them? He was teaching them the laws of the offering of the Omer in the temple. I mean, the laws of the offering of the Omer, there was no temple at that time, it was destroyed. The offering of the Omer was some abstract, non-practical law at that time. What could possibly have been the purpose of Mordechai teaching 22,000 children this piece of abstract Jewish law during a time of existential annihilation? The purpose was that he was trying to draw the presence of God upon the Jewish people. How do you do that? Through the study of Torah. When you study Torah, you bring God's speed to your business deals, God's speed to your leases and your agreements and your contracts and your investments, right? You're bringing God's speed through studying Torah and through doing mitzvahs. That's what you're doing. That's why Jews will study Torah every single day without excuse. That's what Jews will do mitzvahs without excuse, always. They're not going to say, well, it's costs 5 cents more to buy kosher meat, and it costs a lot more money to send your kids to a private Jewish school, and it's longer drive to the kosher butcher. We don't complain about these things because what would not justify the introduction of infinity to my life? Is it worth a $50 surcharge? Is it worth a $5,000 surcharge for infinity? I would think so. You know, when you understand what it is that you're buying, the cost of getting there is absolutely, whatever it is, it's worth it, right? It's absolutely worth it, right? Okay, so now this to me is the most beautiful part. What excites me most about the chapter is when the Alter Rebbe gets into we understand what the fire is, right? The fire is the divine presence. And we understand what the oil is, that's Torah mitzvahs. But to me, I think the most exciting part is the wick. You see, what the wick is the physical body and the animal soul. Just like the wick in the metaphor of the fire, of the physical fire, the wick becomes incorporated into the flame. It actually becomes transformed, right? I'm dealing here with David, you're electrical engineer, right? You understand subatomic structure. So I would love it if you could give me, fill in my gaps over here. But from what I understand, the wick is actually being transformed from a physical substance into a spiritual energy. I think that's what's happening to it. It's being incorporated into the fire somehow, right? It's being burned up. It's not disappearing. It's changing form. No energy is ever lost. It's just it's the law of the conservation of energy, right? So what's happening now is that the wick is being elevated. It's on an energy level to a higher energy level. Now, applying that to the analog, what that means is that our physical bodies and our natural souls, also known as the animal souls, are there to be elevated, are there to be sanctified through engagement with Torah and mitzvahs. You see, we can easily be angry with God and say, God, why did you give me this dysfunctional life? Why did you give me this body that aches and pains and groans and moans? Why did you give me this kind of upbringing, these kind of parents, that might have been abusive or dysfunctional? Why did you give me this relationship that I'm in, these kind of children, these kind of neighbors, this kind of rabbi? Why did we can have a lot of complaints to God and say, God should have put me into a perfect scenario. Yet, it's this metaphor of the Tanya that puts things into beautiful perspective as we realize that you are exactly where you need to be. And the dysfunction that you harbor within your physical life, your relationships, your environment, your upbringing, is exactly the task which you have been tasked with uplifting. We weren't put into this world in order to escape it. We were placed into this world in order to elevate it, in order to illuminate the darkness. God put us into the cave so that we could light a fire and turn it into a home. When you use your physical reality, when you take your physical reality and you use it as the wick, together with Torah and mitzvahs, with the flame, to allow the light to shine upon you, the light of the divine presence to shine upon you, then what you're actually doing is not just bringing God down to this world, you're bringing God down to a part of this world that God was never invited into before. We've learned this theme earlier in Tanya that God has made himself vulnerable to our choices. God Almighty has made himself vulnerable to the choices of mortals, which is an unbelievable idea, right? He needs us to do the right thing in order to bring redemption and higher consciousness to the world. Higher consciousness will not come unless we choose to allow it in, right? Where is God? Someone once asked. And the Kotzker Rebbe responded, God is wherever you let him in, right? So unless you've allowed God into your particular darkness, into your physical reality, God can't enter into there. So the challenges and struggles and tribulations that you've experienced in your life are by divine design, because those troubles you have been empowered to illuminate. And that's what I love about the metaphor of the Zohar, which the Alter Rebbe clarifies over the past 18 chapters in Tanya, is that the wick is not the problem that needs to be destroyed. It's the fuel that allows the purpose to be fulfilled. So if you look at your problems, not as problems, but as platforms, not as struggles, but as springboards, it changes our perspective on how we feel about the challenges that we face. Suddenly now, we look at our struggles and we say, if this relationship, if this difficult parent that I have, or if this inner demon that I have, some inner anxiety or attachment or a codependency or a self-esteem problem that I have, right? Whatever is your problem, when you look at your problem and say, that's my problem, so obviously God wants me to use this as my wick, right? This is a strand in my wick to bring the divine light upon me. Then you're empowered to realize that you're not a victim of circumstance. You're empowered to fulfill the purpose of creation into your dark corner of the world. And that to me is a transformational idea. That a Jew is always happy. A chassid is always happy, knowing that nothing is by mistake. Everything is by divine design. I am exactly where I need to be. I have exactly what I need, and what I don't have, I simply do not need. How do you burn the wick? When it's soaked with oil. When you take your physical life, your physical body, and you make sure it's soaked with oil. Have you sweated over a mitzvah recently? Have you sweated? Perspired over a mitzvah recently? I met a Jew yesterday. He walked into our shul. I was in the middle of a meeting. He walked in here. The guy was drenched from head to toe. He was looked like he just walked out of a shower. Every piece of clothing upon him. was soaked because of a mitzvah that he had been doing for 5 hours. I wanted to hug him, but I was like, it's a long story. He was building an Eruv for us. We're building an Eruv here in Palm Beach Gardens that will allow us to carry on Shabbos. More to come about that. But how beautiful that was. I looked at him and I'm like, wow, that wick is just soaked in oil. He's just soaked in the oil of the mitzvah. There's actually a beautiful story of the Chabad yeshiva. It's called Yeshiva's Tamchei Tmimim, the yeshiva of Chabad. It's about it was established in 1897, and in Lubavitch, and the town of Lubavitch in Belarusia. So they were very, very careful with the kind of students that they allowed into the yeshiva. And at one point, there was a student that they were not really wanting to allow to stay in the yeshiva. And as a result of his hard work preparing the matzahs for Pesach, he sweated so much that the Rebbe had said at the time that the sweat of the mitzvah transformed him. Right? It's that wick, which is soaked with oil, that allows the fire to shine, right? Think of yourself that way, and what a gorgeous opportunity it is when you come to build your sukkah, God willing, in a few weeks' time. We're preparing for sukkahs. We're going to be building our sukkahs, right? You're going to go out there and sweat it out when you walk to shul in Shabbos, right? And you're sweating it out, right? Think of every drip of sweat as soaking your wick in oil. In the oil of Torah and mitzvahs, right? When you study, can you imagine meditating upon Torah until the point that you break out in a sweat? Think about that. It's amazing, right? It might be easier to do that outdoors than indoors. but that is an extraordinary achievement, to realize that our bodies and our animal souls are wicks. Now, our animal souls have dark and sinister intentions. We learned in chapter 7 of Tanya that the evil desires of our natural and animal souls are really like the prostitute who was hired by the king to test the prince. We learned about that idea, that even the prostitute really is a loyal subject of the king, and she wants the prince to prevail over her and not to succumb to her temptations, right? So to our animal soul really is a very, very good player. Wants to tempt us, but is hoping that we're going to overcome him. Right? So instead of looking at your animal soul as the enemy, look at your animal soul as the wick that's going to allow the fire to burn. There's a beautiful verse in Torah, which the Baal Shem Tov explains like this: when you will see the donkey of your enemy buckling under its weight, you shall not ignore him, you shall surely help him. Right? It's talking about, on a literal level, it's talking about if you're driving down the road and you see your friend's Mercedes-Benz broken down in the side of the road. Sorry, your enemy's Mercedes-Benz broken down in the side of the road. Instead of saying, shout and fraud, I'm happy, right? You should go over and help him, right? That's on a very literal level. But the way the Baal Shem Tov explains it like this, he says, when you see the donkey, the word donkey means physicality. Physicality. When you see your physicality buckling under its weight, and you'll think that your physical part of you, your animal soul, your body, you'll think of it as your enemy, and you want to abandon your enemy? No, says the Baal Shem Tov, it's not your enemy. Your physical body is not your enemy. It might look like your enemy. Your animal soul might look like the enemy, but it's not. Your animal soul really is waiting for you to put a harness on it and to learn to ride it. Right? That's all it is. It's a wick waiting to be kindled. No, so what are you waiting for? Right? Without the wick, not only is the wick sublimated through the flame, but it actually serves a vital role, because without the wick, the flame would be unable to burn. The Torah could not fulfill its purpose upon this physical earth without the dysfunctional components of our lives, the wick. And then the Alter Rebbe concludes the chapter by saying, even the Beinani. Remember the Beinani? We learned about him in the first 15 chapters of Tanya. There were three kinds of Jews, right? The Beinani, the tzaddik, is the one that has transformed his evil inclination. He's the one that has learned to ride his horse, right? He doesn't struggle against his evil inclination. He only desires to do the right thing. But the Beinani is the one in the middle Jew, the intermediary Jew. Remember, the Tanya is the book of Beinanim, the book of intermediary Jews, the book of ordinary Jews. The Beinani is the one that struggles ferociously within him. His animal soul fights strongly against his godly soul within him. He has a very strong desire for evil. Yet he's vigilant on a thought, speech, and action level. When it comes to actual expression, that's when the Beinoni never gives expression to his animal soul. But inside, the battle rages ferociously within him. So even the Beinoni, who thinks that his life is a epic failure, who thinks that since he's not able to transform his animal soul into godliness like a tzaddik, he thinks that he's a failure. Says the Alter Rebbe, no. Even the Beinoni, when he controls his thought, speech, and action, his soul garments, he thus is able to think the right thing and do the right thing and say the right thing, right? He's thus able to illuminate his animal soul and his physical body and his physical place upon this earth through the mitzvahs that he does and he thinks and he says. Thought, speech, and action. Every single time that he thinks and does and thinks, does, and says, right? Thought, speech, and action. Every time he expresses a mitzvah, what he's doing is that he's vanquishing the desire of his animal soul. He's literally chipping away at the wick. He's like smashing a flintstone upon the wick, right? So the fact that he struggles within isn't just something which is tolerated. It's something which is appreciated, because what he's actually doing is that he's got a very strong wick, which will allow for a much greater light to shine upon the flame. In other words, the metaphor of the candle gives us profound meaning in our lives in the analog. It tells us that the purpose of our lives, and this is the conclusion of the first part of Tanya, the purpose of our lives is not about the destination. It's not about the finish line. It's not about being able to say, okay, I've transformed my animal soul into good. I'm now a tzaddik, mazel tov. That's not the point. The mashal, the metaphor of the candle, inspires us to appreciate every single step of the journey of transformation. That every single time that we struggle with our evil inclination and we choose nonetheless to do a mitzvah in thought, speech, or action, we are lighting a fire using the oil upon the wick. We're fulfilling the purpose for which God placed us upon this earth. Winston is asking a question. Wick is a noun, a strip of porous material upon which liquid fuel is drawn by capillary action to the flame in a candle, lamp, or lighter. Beautiful. Okay, so that's not a question. You're just giving me a definition of the word wick. Wonderful. Elaine, the Torah is compared to water. Oil and water are incompatible. Confused. The Torah is compared to water, correct. Oil and water are incompatible. I think, Elaine, you're confusing your metaphors. That's all. You're just confusing your metaphors. There's a metaphor in which oil is compared to water. In which Torah is compared to water, right? And there's something about water which is similar to Torah, and that we learned about that in Tanya chapter 5, that just like water flows from a very, very high place to a very, very low place, like an angel falls, right? The same water goes from very high to very low. So too, Torah brings down the same godly energy from very, very high to very, very low. That was the metaphor of the water. That's it. So it brings out one element. When we speak about Torah as oil, it is what allows the flame to burn. Don't confuse your metaphor with your analog, right? You don't have to mix oil and water now to be able to make the fire. Right? One thing we learn Torah comparing Torah to water. Another thing we learn Torah comparing Torah to oil. Right? One is Tanya chapter 5. One is Tanya chapter 35. And don't mix. They're two separate metaphors. Right? They don't have to coexist at the same time. But anyway, it's a good thing that you brought that up. In any event, this, my friends, now concludes chapter 53 of Tanya. It's been an incredible journey. We're not ending it right here. Next week, we'll continue straight on into chapter 1, 2, 3, and 11, which are the missing chapters, after which we will be printing, God willing, the Tanya here in Palm Beach Gardens. All very exciting. And the learning never stops, right? We're taking it to a whole new level. I'm excited to announce right here that, having taken into consideration much of your feedback in our new semester, starting in just a week or two, we will be launching a brand new regimen of study in which we will be learning not only once a week Tanya, but we will also be learning Hasidic discourses also on another day of the week. So we'll be having 2 mornings a week for Hasidus instead of 1 morning a week. One will be the regimen of Tanya. The other one will be other Hasidic discourses, which we will be talking about. So stay tuned for that as we modify, improve, and develop our daily Torah study. Don't forget to send me an email with any of your questions, comments, or concerns at rabbi@jewishgardens.com. That's rabbi@jewishgardens.com. I thank you very much, everybody, for joining me this morning. It's always a pleasure to study with you. The learning never stops, so please do review the videos at the link which Winston has posted here on YouTube and on Facebook. You can find those links, those Tanya playlists at youtube.com/Jewish Gardens. That's youtube.com/Jewish Gardens. I know that you, Ed, will often listen to a class 2 and 3 times to be able to review it and make sure that you got it, which is certainly the way to study Torah. So thank you very much for that inspiration, Ed. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me here today. Shalom, and have a wonderful day.